I discovered my $4 million trust fund, money my grandparents had saved for my future, had been drained to prop up my brother's failing tech startup. For 7 years, I believed the lie that market downturns had decimated my inheritance. Until one dedicated trustee refused to sign off on the annual report, triggering an audit that would expose everything. What happened next changed not just my financial future, but redefined what family truly means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as Eliza Harrington meant living in the perpetual shadow of brilliance. Not my own, my brother Nathan's. While I excelled in practical matters that kept our family functioning, Nathan dazzled everyone with his charismatic ideas and ambitious vision. This wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was the fundamental dynamic that defined our family hierarchy. "Nathan's going to change the world someday," my father would announce at family gatherings, his hand clasped proudly on my brother's shoulder. Nathan would smile with practiced modesty while I quietly refilled everyone's drinks and made sure the evening ran smoothly. Our childhood home in Westlake was divided into 2 distinct territories: the spaces where Nathan's achievements were displayed, trophies, science fair ribbons, newspaper clippings about his coding prodigy, and the rest of the house where I existed in the background, ensuring everything functioned properly while receiving little acknowledgement. I didn't resent this arrangement, not consciously at least. Nathan was genuinely brilliant. At 17, he had developed a music algorithm that predicted listener preferences with impressive accuracy. By 23, he had been featured in technology magazines as one of the 30 under 30 innovators to watch. His success seemed predestined, and my supporting role appeared equally natural. My strengths were different. I was organized, detail-oriented, and remarkably good at anticipating problems before they arose. These qualities made me an excellent operations manager at Meridian Healthcare, where I had worked my way up over 8 years. My colleagues valued my contributions, but in my family, these same qualities were seen as merely practical rather than exceptional. "Not everyone can be extraordinary," my mother once told me, intending it as comfort. "The world needs reliable people too, Eliza." The subtext was clear. Nathan was extraordinary. I was reliable. This dynamic extended to our financial situations as well. When our grandparents passed away 5 years apart, first grandfather, then grandmother, they left substantial trust funds for both of us. Nathan received his at 25 with no restrictions. I would receive mine at 30 with quarterly distributions until then. The explanation was that Nathan needed capital for his ventures, while I would benefit from financial guidance longer. I accepted this reasoning. After all, Nathan was building revolutionary technology while I was managing hospital operations. His needs seemed greater, his potential return on investment more significant. This was the narrative I had internalized throughout my life. Nathan's dreams deserved priority because they were simply more important. By the time I turned 28, Nathan had launched TechNexus, his 3rd startup. The first 2 had shown initial promise before failing due to what Nathan called market timing issues, but what I privately suspected were execution problems. Nathan could envision brilliant concepts but struggled with the mundane reality of building sustainable businesses. TechNexus was different, Nathan insisted. It would develop an artificial intelligence platform for predictive healthcare, combining his technological expertise with my industry. He spoke about it with such conviction that everyone believed in its inevitable success, including our parents who had invested a significant portion of their retirement savings in the venture. "This is the one, Liz," Nathan told me over coffee, near my apartment in the city. "We're going to revolutionize preventative care. Imagine algorithms that can predict health crises before symptoms even appear." His eyes shone with the familiar intensity that had charmed investors and family members alike throughout his life. "It sounds amazing," I said, genuinely impressed by the concept. Have you thought about implementation challenges? Healthcare? Systems are notoriously resistant to technological overhauls. Nathan waved away my concern. That's just logistics. The technology is what matters. Once we demonstrate the capability, hospitals will line up to adopt it. This was our typical pattern. Nathan would envision the destination. I would worry about the road to get there. His dismissal of practical concerns wasn't malicious. He simply operated in a world where vision trumped execution, where someone else would inevitably handle the details. 2 months after launching TechNexus, Nathan invited me to tour their new offices in the downtown technology corridor. The space was impressive. Open concept with glass-walled conference rooms, state-of-the-art equipment, and a team of 15 developers and data scientists working diligently at sleek workstations. We're burning through cash faster than expected, Nathan admitted as he showed me around. Development costs are higher than we projected, but that's normal for groundbreaking technology. What's your runway? I asked, falling into my natural role of practical assessor. About 8 months at current burn rate, he replied with unwarranted confidence. But we're closing another funding round soon. Several VCs are interested. I nodded, suppressing my instinct to ask for details about these supposed interested investors. Nathan had always lived in a world of imminent possibilities rather than concrete realities. That evening, I received a call from my parents asking me to come to dinner on Sunday. Nathan has a proposal he wants to discuss with the family, my mother explained, her voice carrying that familiar note of excitement that only Nathan's ideas could generate. Sunday dinner at my parents' suburban home followed decades of established ritual. My mother prepared more food than necessary, my father poured drinks with generous hands, and conversation inevitably centered around Nathan's latest pursuits. I arrived early to help in the kitchen, another unspoken expectation, while Nathan would arrive fashionably late, ensuring he made an entrance. TechNexus is at a critical juncture, Nathan announced after dinner, standing at the head of the table with a glass of our father's expensive scotch in hand. We've developed the core algorithm, but we need additional funding to complete the clinical validation phase. My parents nodded encouragingly, pride evident in their expressions. I maintained my customary attentive silence, already anticipating where this conversation was heading. The venture capital market has tightened recently, Nathan continued, his charismatic confidence never wavering. Investors are being more cautious, but this is exactly when the biggest opportunities arise for those willing to be bold. What are you thinking, son? My father asked, leaning forward with interest. Nathan took a deliberate sip of his scotch before answering. I believe we should consolidate family resources to push TechNexus through this temporary funding gap. Once we complete validation, we'll be positioned for a major Series A round that will deliver returns far exceeding our investment. The room fell silent for a moment as his words settled. I knew what was coming next, could feel it approaching like an inevitable wave. Eliza, my mother said, turning to me with an expression of practiced reasonableness. We've been thinking about your trust fund. And there it was, the moment when being the reliable, practical sibling transformed from a personality trait into a financial expectation. The conversation that followed would alter the course of my life, though not in the way any of us anticipated. That evening, what I couldn't have known then was that this familiar family dynamic, Nathan leading, everyone following, Eliza supporting, was about to encounter an unexpected catalyst that would reveal truths none of us were prepared to face. We need to discuss something important, my father continued, setting down his wine glass with deliberate care. Nathan's company is at a critical inflection point. The technology works, it's revolutionary, but they need capital to bridge until the next funding round. My mother nodded enthusiastically. The potential return is extraordinary. Nathan's platform could transform healthcare completely. I glanced at Nathan, who maintained the confident smile that had opened doors for him throughout his life. His expression revealed absolute certainty that this conversation would end with him getting exactly what he wanted. "What does this have to do with my trust fund?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My father cleared his throat. "We believe it would be strategically advantageous to allocate a portion of your trust fund to TechNexus. It's still 2T. Years before you gain full control, and this investment opportunity is time-sensitive." "A portion?" I repeated. "How much are we talking about?" Nathan leaned forward. "We'd need about 60% to comfortably reach our validation milestones." The room momentarily blurred as I processed his words. 60% of my trust fund represented nearly $1.5 million, money my grandparents had specifically designated for my future. "That's substantial," I managed to say, maintaining my composure through practiced restraint. "Have you approached other investors?" "Of course," Nathan replied smoothly. "But traditional VCs move too slowly for our timeline. They want to see the clinical validation results before committing. That's exactly the catch-22 we're trying to solve." My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Honey, this isn't just about helping your brother. It's an investment opportunity. The projected returns would more than replenish your trust fund within 3 years. And the family stays in control," my father added. "No dilution from outside investors. With different priorities." I looked at each of their expectant faces, feeling the familiar weight of family expectations pressing down. Throughout my life, supporting Nathan's brilliance had been my unspoken responsibility. From helping him with school projects he'd left, until the last minute to making excuses when he missed family obligations because he was working on something important, I had always been the one who accommodated. "Don't I need to authorize any withdrawal from my trust?" I asked, grasping for practical obstacles. "Well, technically, your father and I are co-trustees until you turn 30, my mother explained. "The trust allows for investments at trustee discretion." "But we wouldn't proceed without your blessing," my father added quickly, though his tone suggested this was a formality rather than a genuine requirement. I took a deep breath. "Can I see the business plan? The financial projections? The clinical trial design?" Even as I asked these questions, I recognized I was following my typical pattern. Not refusing outright, but seeking information, looking for problems to solve rather than boundaries to enforce. Nathan smiled. "Of course. I'll have my CFO send everything over tomorrow. You'll see the numbers are solid." The conversation then shifted to implementation details, how the investment would be structured, expected timelines, contingency plans, all discussed with the underlying assumption that my agreement was a foregone conclusion. After all, when had Eliza Harrington ever stood in the way of her brother's vision? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that evening, as I drove back to my apartment, a peculiar sense of unreality settled over me. The practical part of my brain, the part that had made me successful in my career, was already calculating implications. How would this affect my plans to purchase a condo next year? What about my intention to pursue an executive MBA? These considerations felt selfish in the face of Nathan's revolutionary technology that could save countless lives, as my father had repeatedly emphasized. The following day, a thick folder arrived from TechNexus containing the promised documentation. I spent my evening reviewing financial projections that seemed wildly optimistic, market analyses that glossed over significant regulatory hurdles, and development timelines that assumed best-case scenarios at every juncture. The clinical validation plan particularly concerned me. It lacked the rigor healthcare institutions would require before adopting new technology. I drafted a detailed email outlining my concerns, complete with specific questions and suggestions for strengthening the approach. This was my standard operating procedure. Identify problems, propose solutions, Facilitate success. As my finger hovered over the send button, a question surfaced from some previously silent part of my consciousness. Why am I trying to improve a plan designed to spend my inheritance? I saved the draft and instead sent a shorter message requesting a meeting with Nathan and his CFO. 2 days later, I sat across from them in TechNexus's sleek conference room, my concerns organized in a neat spreadsheet. These projections assume 40% adoption within 18 months of market entry, I noted, pointing to a specific row. That seems extremely aggressive given healthcare's typical implementation timeline. Joseph Chen, TechNexus's CFO, exchanged a glance with Nathan before responding. We have preliminary commitments from several major hospital systems who are enthusiastic about early adoption. Can I see those commitments? I asked. They're not formalized yet, Nathan interjected. But we have strong verbal indications. I continued through my list of concerns: unrealistic revenue projections, underestimated regulatory hurdles, insufficient attention to implementation challenges, while Nathan and Joseph offered explanations that consistently circled back to the transformative potential of the technology rather than addressing practical obstacles. Listen, Liz, Nathan said finally, his patience visibly wearing thin. I understand you're being thorough. That's your nature. But you're approaching this like a standard business case, and TechNexus isn't standard. We're creating something revolutionary. Revolutionary still requires executable plans, I replied, keeping my voice even. This is why we need someone with vision leading this company, not someone who gets bogged down in details. The comment wasn't delivered with malice, but as a simple statement of fact, the same distinction between us that had been reinforced throughout our lives. I closed my laptop. I just want to ensure the investment is sound before committing such a significant portion of my trust fund. It's not just about the money, Nathan said, his expression softening. This is a chance for us to build something meaningful together. Your healthcare expertise combined with my technology, the Harrington siblings changing the world. It was a compelling vision, artfully presented. Despite my reservations, I found myself wanting to believe in it, wanting to be part of something extraordinary rather than merely reliable. I need some time to think, I said finally. Nathan smiled, confidence undiminished. Of course. But remember, our runway is limited. We need to move quickly if we're going to seize this opportunity. As I left the TechNexus office, I felt the familiar pull between rational assessment and emotional obligation. The practical part of me recognized the flaws in Nathan's plan. The sister in me wanted to support his dream. The daughter in me wanted to fulfill my parents' expectations. My phone rang as I reached my car. It was Richard Whitman, my grandparents' longtime attorney who served as the third trustee on my trust fund. Though he played a largely administrative role, signing off on quarterly distributions and annual reports, he had always treated me with a respect that acknowledged my intelligence rather than merely my reliability. Eliza, I'm glad I caught you, he said when I answered. I received some paperwork regarding a proposed investment of trust assets. Do you have a moment to discuss it? My stomach tightened. They've already started the process? I received authorization documents this morning requiring trustee signatures, he confirmed, his tone carefully neutral. I wanted to speak with you before proceeding. I haven't made a decision yet, I said, a flicker of anger rising. I'm still evaluating the proposal. I see. The pause that followed carried weight. Perhaps we should meet in person to discuss this further, my office tomorrow morning? I agreed, and as I drove home, my thoughts shifted from analyzing Nathan's business plan to examining my family's dynamics. They had begun the process of allocating my trust fund before I'd given my answer, operating under the assumption that my agreement was inevitable, a mere formality. It was a pattern so familiar I had almost missed its significance. My agency was secondary to Nathan's needs. That evening, my mother called. "Your father and I signed the preliminary authorization papers today," she said brightly. "Richard just needs to add his signature, and then we can transfer the first installment to TechNexus. Nathan is so excited about you joining the journey." I gripped my phone tighter. "Mom, I told Nathan I needed time to think. I haven't agreed to this investment." "Oh." Her surprise sounded genuine. "We assumed after your meeting that you were on board. The opportunity is time-sensitive, Eliza. We need to move quickly." "It's my trust fund," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I should have the final say in how it's invested." "Of course, dear," she replied, her tone shifting to the placating one she used when she thought I was being unnecessarily difficult. "But your father and I are still the legal trustees. We're just doing what's best for the family." The implications of her statement hung between us. In the Harrington family hierarchy, what was best for the family had always aligned remarkably well with what was best for Nathan. "I'm meeting with Richard tomorrow," I said finally. "Let's discuss this after that." As I ended the call, I realized I had reached a crossroads I'd been approaching my entire life. The path of least resistance, accommodating Nathan's needs, while minimizing my own, stretched before me, familiar and well-trodden. The alternative path remained undefined, obscured by a lifetime of putting others first, but for the first time, I felt compelled to explore it. My meeting with Richard Whitman the next morning would become the catalyst that changed everything, though neither of us could have predicted just how completely it would transform not just my financial future, but the fundamental dynamics that had defined our family for decades. Richard Whitman's law office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building with views of the harbor. Unlike the sleek, modern aesthetic of TechNexus, Whitman and Associates embraced traditional professionalism, dark wood furnishings, leather-bound legal texts, and discreet lighting that conveyed stability and trustworthiness. The receptionist escorted me immediately to Richard's office, where he rose from behind his substantial desk to greet me. At 67, Richard Whitman retained the sharp alertness that had made him my grandparents' trusted advisor for over 3 decades. "Eliza, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair. "I thought this conversation warranted privacy." I settled into the chair, noting the folder centered on his desk, undoubtedly the investment authorization, documents my parents had already signed. "I was surprised to receive these papers," Richard began, tapping the folder, "particularly given the size of the proposed allocation. 60% of your trust is substantial." "I haven't agreed to it," I replied. "My parents and brother seem to have gotten ahead of themselves." Richard's expression revealed nothing, but he nodded thoughtfully. "I see. That puts me in an interesting position as the third trustee." "What exactly would your role be in this?" I asked. "Could my parents proceed without your signature?" "Technically, no. The trust requires 2 of 3 trustees to approve any significant investment change, and since you're not yet 30, you're not officially a trustee yourself." He leaned back slightly. "Your grandparents structured it this way deliberately. They wanted checks and balances in place. This was news to me. I'd always assumed my parents had complete control until my 30th birthday. The revelation that Richard's signature was not merely procedural but necessary changed the dynamic significantly. "So you could decline to sign?" I asked cautiously. "I could," he confirmed. "Though in my 25 years overseeing family trusts, I've rarely found it necessary to oppose parents' wishes regarding their children's funds." He studied me carefully. "But something tells me this situation might warrant closer examination." I took a deep breath and explained everything. Nathan's company, the family dinner, my review of the business documentation, and my concerns about both the investment viability and the assumption that I would simply agree. Richard listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he remained silent for a moment, organizing his thoughts. Your grandparents were remarkable people, he said finally. Prudent, thoughtful, forward-thinking. They built their wealth through careful investments and disciplined decision-making, not through speculation. I nodded, having heard the story many times. My grandfather had started with a small inheritance, methodically growing it through strategic real estate investments and conservative stock holdings. My grandmother, contrary to the expectations of her generation, had been an equal partner in their financial decisions, often being the more cautious voice. They established separate trusts for you and Nathan with identical terms. Access at 30, quarterly distributions until then, Richard continued. The only difference was your father and mother were named as co-trustees for both, with me as the third trustee. But Nathan received his trust early, I pointed out. Yes, at 25, Richard confirmed. Your parents petitioned for early release based on exceptional circumstances. Nathan's first company needed capital, and they argued the opportunity justified modifying the terms. And you agreed? The question came out more accusatory than I'd intended. Richard's expression grew thoughtful. I did, though not without reservations. The business plan was more solid than what you've described for his current venture, and the requested amount was only 20% of his total trust. Something in his tone made me pause. What happened to the rest of Nathan's trust fund? Richard hesitated, weighing professional discretion against relevant disclosure. The remainder was released in full when he turned 27, again at your parents' request, with my reluctant agreement. That was 3 years ago. The implication settled heavily in the room. If Nathan had received his entire trust fund 3 years ago and was now seeking 60% of mine, what had happened to his money? And now they want to use my trust to fund TechNexus, I said slowly, pieces falling into place. Because Nathan has already depleted his own resources. I can't speak to Mr. Harrington's current financial situation, Richard replied carefully. But the timing and circumstances do raise questions a prudent trustee should consider. I felt a strange sense of clarity emerging through my confusion. The family dynamic that had seemed natural, almost inevitable, throughout my life, suddenly appeared constructed rather than inherent. Nathan's position as the brilliant visionary deserving special consideration wasn't merely a function of his natural talents, but actively reinforced by my parents' decisions and my own acquiescence. What would my grandparents say about this situation? I asked quietly. Richard's professional reserve softened slightly. Based on my 30 years advising them, I believe they would have significant concerns. They were staunch believers in financial independence and personal responsibility. They established separate trusts to ensure each grandchild would have resources for their own future, not to fund each other's ventures. His words resonated with memories of my grandmother in particular. Despite her traditional exterior, she had maintained her own investment portfolio even within their marriage. A woman must always have her own resources, she had told me once. Love doesn't preclude prudence. The trust doesn't legally mature for another 2 years, I said, thinking loud. But if you declined to sign these authorization documents, what would happen? Your parents could petition the court to override my decision or have me removed as trustee, Richard explained. That would take time, require legal justification, and frankly, might not succeed given the circumstances. Alternatively, they could modify the proposal to address legitimate concerns, seeking a smaller allocation or adding protections. And if they proceeded with the full proposal? Richard straightened in his chair, his expression turning more formal. Then I would need to decide whether my fiduciary responsibility to protect your trust requires me to decline authorization. The implicit offer hung in the air between us, a potential ally in a situation where I had assumed I stood alone. For a moment I imagined the scenario. Richard refusing to sign, my parents' shock and anger, Nathan's disbelief that his plan had encountered genuine resistance. The ensuing family conflict would be unprecedented. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Richard nodded. These are significant decisions with long-term implications. Take whatever time you need. He paused briefly. However, there is one additional matter we should discuss. I raised an eyebrow questioningly. As part of my trustee responsibilities, I review annual statements for all trusts under my purview, he explained. The most recent statement for your trust shows some concerning discrepancies that warrant clarification. Discrepancies? I repeated, a new worry surfacing. What kind of discrepancies? Several substantial withdrawals over the past 18 months categorized as investment diversification. The documentation is technically compliant, but lacks the detail I typically expect. Given the current proposal, I believe these transactions merit closer examination. My pulse quickened. Are you saying money has already been taken from my trust? Richard chose his words carefully. I'm saying there have been significant allocations that deserve verification. Before making any decision about the current proposal, I intend to request comprehensive documentation for these previous transactions. The implication struck me like a physical blow. Had my parents already been diverting my trust fund without my knowledge? Was the current proposal merely a formalization of a process already underway? I thought I received quarterly statements, I said, struggling to maintain composure. The statements go to the primary trustee address on file, Richard explained. In this case, your parents' home. They're required to make them available to you upon request, but many beneficiaries don't actively review them before assuming full control. Another assumption I had never questioned, that my parents were transparently managing my trust as my grandparents had intended. The foundation of trust that had seemed so solid was revealing concerning cracks. I'd like to see those statements, I said firmly. All of them, going back at least 2 years. Richard nodded approvingly. I'll have copies prepared immediately. In the meantime, I'll inform your parents that I'm conducting a standard review before considering the current investment proposal. As I prepared to leave, Richard asked a final question that would echo in my thoughts for days afterward. Eliza, if this were any investment opportunity presented by someone outside your family, would you consider it sound? The answer was immediately clear, though I had been avoiding it. No. The fundamentals don't support the risk, the projections are unrealistic, and the business plan has significant gaps. Then perhaps the question isn't whether this is a good investment for your trust, Richard suggested gently. But why? You're expected to approach it differently because it's your brother's company. Driving back to my apartment, I felt as though I was seeing my family through a new lens, one that brought long-established patterns into sharper, more questionable focus. The expectation that I would subordinate my interest to Nathan's wasn't a natural law but a constructed reality I had accepted without examination. My phone buzzed repeatedly during the drive, texts from my mother asking about my meeting with Richard, a message from Nathan inquiring when the paperwork would be finalized, and finally a call from my father that I let go to voicemail. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, trying to process the implications of my conversation with Richard. The possibility that my parents had already been allocating my trust funds to Nathan's ventures without my knowledge transformed what had felt like a difficult family negotiation into something more troubling. My phone rang again, my father for the 3rd time. Taking a deep breath, I answered. Eliza, what did you say to Richard? He demanded without preamble. He's suddenly requesting extensive documentation and talking about a comprehensive review before processing the authorization. I expressed concerns about the investment, I replied, keeping my voice steady. And apparently he has some questions about previous transactions as well. A telling silence followed. Those were standard portfolio adjustments, my father said finally. Nothing that requires special scrutiny. Then there should be no problem providing the documentation Richard requested, I countered. This is unnecessarily complicated, Eliza, he said, frustration evident. Nathan's company needs this capital within weeks, not months. Your mother and I are trying to secure an opportunity that benefits everyone. Why are you fighting this? The question struck me as remarkable in its presumption. I'm not fighting anything, Dad. I'm trying to make an informed decision about a significant portion of my financial future. This isn't just about money, he insisted. It's about family loyalty and supporting each other. Your brother has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and you're holding it hostage over paperwork. The characterization stung, but also illuminated. The fundamental imbalance. My caution was hostility, while Nathan's request for $5 million was simply family support. I'll review the complete trust statements when Richard provides them, I said firmly. Then we can discuss next steps. My father's sigh conveyed profound disappointment. Your brother and mother will be devastated by your lack of faith in this family. After we disconnected, I sat motionless, absorbing the weight of his words and their implicit message. Questioning the established order made me disloyal rather than prudent. It was a perspective that had shaped our family dynamics for decades, creating a foundation of inequality that had seemed natural until this moment. As evening settled over the city, I made a decision that would alter my path irrevocably. I would no longer accept that foundation as immutable. The audit Richard had initiated would either confirm my growing suspicions or dispel them. Either way, I would finally know the truth about the resources my grandparents had intended for my future. What I couldn't yet imagine was how completely that truth would transform not just my financial situation, but my understanding of myself and my place within the family that had defined me for 28 years. 3 days after my meeting with Richard, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to my apartment. Inside was a USB drive containing 7 years of trust statements and transaction records, along with a brief note from Richard. Review thoroughly. Call when ready to discuss. RWBU. I took the day off work, cleared my dining table, and set up my laptop. As operations manager at Meridian Healthcare, I regularly analyzed complex financial documents and identified discrepancies. Now I would apply those same skills to my own trust fund, a task that should have felt routine, but instead carried profound emotional weight. The initial review confirmed the trust's original structure, approximately $4 million invested in a balanced portfolio, with quarterly distributions of $15,000 directed to an account in my name. These distributions had arrived consistently, and I had never questioned the underlying asset management. Everything appeared normal until 18 months ago. Then, the pattern changed. First came a withdrawal of $175,000 labeled Alternative Investment Opportunity, High Growth Portfolio. 3 months later, another $220,000 disappeared under Strategic Diversification Initiative. 5 more transactions followed over the next year, each between $150,000 and $300,000, all with similarly vague descriptions. In total, nearly $4 million, almost 60% of my trust, had been withdrawn through these transactions. The timing aligned perfectly with Nathan's launch of TechNexus and its subsequent funding challenges. My hands trembled slightly as I created a spreadsheet tracking these withdrawals against what I knew of TechNexus's timeline. The correlation was undeniable. My parents had been systematically transferring my trust fund to Nathan's company for over a year, disguising the transactions as investment diversification. Most disturbing was the realization that the current proposal wasn't seeking permission to use my trust fund. It was attempting to legitimize what they had already done while securing access to what remained. I stared at my analysis, a cold clarity settling over me. This wasn't just poor financial judgment or familial bias. This was deliberate deception. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was my mother. "Eliza, we need to talk about this situation with Richard," she said immediately. He's making unreasonable demands for documentation and delaying a time-sensitive opportunity. I glanced at my computer screen, where the evidence of their deception was organized in meticulous detail. I'm reviewing the trust statements now. Actually, a pause. Those statements can be confusing without context. Your father should walk you through them. They seem pretty straightforward, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Especially the series of withdrawals over the past 18 months. Almost $1. 4 million labeled as alternative investments and strategic diversification. The silence that followed confirmed everything. Those are perfectly legitimate investment reallocations, she finally said, her voice tight. The trust allows for portfolio adjustments at trustee discretion. Where exactly were these funds invested, Mom? Another telling pause. Various growth opportunities. Your father handled the specifics. Were they invested in TechNexus? I asked directly. Not exclusively, she hedged. Though some capital was directed to your brother's company as part of a balanced approach to higher yield investments. Some capital, I repeated. Would that be the entire $4 million? Eliza, you're focusing on details instead of the bigger picture, my mother deflected, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when trying to reframe a situation. Your father and I made decisions we believed would benefit both our children. Nathan's success will ultimately enhance your financial position as well. So you took money designated for my future and gave it to Nathan without telling me. We didn't take anything, she countered, an edge entering her voice. We made investment decisions as trustees, which is our legal right. And the current proposal to invest 60% of my trust, that would be the remaining 40% you haven't already transferred? Her silence was answer enough. I think we should continue this conversation with Dad and Nathan present, I said firmly. And Richard should be included as well. There's no need to involve outside parties in family matters, my mother replied. Quickly. Richard is a trustee, not an outside party, I pointed out. And given what I've discovered, his involvement seems essential. My mother sighed dramatically. If you insist on making this adversarial, we can meet tomorrow evening at our house. But I hope you'll approach this with an open mind about what's best for this family. After we disconnected, I sent the spreadsheet I'd created to Richard, along with a brief message explaining my findings and the scheduled family meeting. His response came within the hour. I'll attend, bringing Jennifer Chen from accounting. This warrants professional documentation. That evening, I received texts from both Nathan and my father, each striking a different tone. Nathan expressed confusion about all the drama over standard business funding, while my father sent a more pointed message. Disappointing to see you creating divisions in this family. Some things matter more than money. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. For years, Nathan's financial needs had been prioritized over mine precisely because money, specifically my money, was considered less important than supporting his ambitions. The double standard was now glaringly obvious. The following evening, I arrived at my parents' house exactly on time, with Richard and Jennifer Chen pulling into the driveway just behind me. My mother opened the door with a tight smile that faltered when she saw Richard wasn't alone. We weren't expecting additional guests, she said pointedly. Jennifer is our forensic accountant, Richard explained calmly. Given the financial complexities we're discussing, her expertise seemed valuable. My father appeared in the foyer, his expression stormy. This is a family discussion, Richard. Bringing outsiders crosses a line. Actually, Edward, as a trustee, with fiduciary responsibilities, ensuring transparent accounting isn't crossing a line, it's observing one. Richard's tone remained professional but firm. We moved to the dining room, where Nathan already sat, looking more annoyed than concerned. The table was set for dinner, an attempt at normalcy that felt jarringly inappropriate given the circumstances. "Let's dispense with pretenses," I said as everyone took their seats. "The trust statements clearly show that approximately $1.4 million has been withdrawn from my trust over the past 18 months. Based on the timing and amounts, it appears these funds were directed to TechNexus." Nathan glanced at our father, who cleared his throat. "The funds were invested in several ventures, TechNexus being one significant opportunity." Jennifer Chen spoke for the first time, her voice precise and professional. "According to our preliminary review, all 7 withdrawals were transferred. To accounts associated with TechNexus Technologies, Inc., we found no evidence of diversification across multiple investments." My mother's face flushed. "Edward handled the technical aspects." "The technical aspect," Richard said carefully, "is that 60% of Eliza's trust was transferred to a high-risk startup without her knowledge or consent, using deliberately vague documentation to obscure the transactions. We acted within our legal authority as trustees," my father insisted. "Actually," Richard countered, "the trust explicitly prohibits self-dealing transactions that benefit immediate family members without formal disclosure and consent. These transactions appear to violate that provision." Nathan leaned forward, his charismatic confidence finally showing cracks. "Look, the money is being put to good use. We're months away from a breakthrough that will revolutionize predictive healthcare. When we secure Series A funding, all of this will be repaid with interest." "And when exactly will that happen?" I asked. "Your original timeline projected Series A 6 months ago." "Markets fluctuate. Investors are cautious, right?" "Now." Nathan's standard explanation sounded hollow against the backdrop of financial reality. "But we're close. That's why we need the additional capital from the remaining trust funds." Jennifer Chen consulted her tablet. "Mr. Harrington, TechNexus's most recent financial statements show a burn rate of approximately $180,000 monthly, with less than $300,000 in available capital. Without additional funding, the company will be insolvent within 60 days. The room fell silent as the precariousness of Nathan's situation became clear. My brother's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to desperation. "This is exactly why we need to proceed with the current proposal," my father argued, "to protect the initial investment and ensure TechNexus reaches its potential." "That's called throwing good money after bad," Richard observed mildly. "And it's exactly what the trust provisions were designed to prevent." "What are our options here?" I asked, addressing Richard and Jennifer rather than my family. Jennifer responded with professional detachment. "Based on our preliminary assessment, the trustees breached their fiduciary duty through these transactions. You could pursue legal remedies to recover the funds, though that process would be lengthy and potentially difficult given TechNexus's financial position." My parents exchanged alarmed glances at the mention of legal action. "Alternatively," Richard added, "we could establish a formal agreement acknowledging the breach and structuring a repayment plan secured by appropriate collateral." "Collateral?" my father repeated incredulously. "You want us to mortgage our home to repay money that was invested for our children's benefit?" "For one child's benefit," I corrected quietly, "at the expense of the other." Nathan pushed back from the table. "I can't believe you're making this about some imagined rivalry. This is business, Eliza. Sometimes investments take time to mature. This stopped being just business when you concealed the source of the funds," I replied. "If you genuinely believe TechNexus was a sound investment for my trust, why not disclose the transactions? Why create fictional diversification initiatives instead of transparent documentation?" Neither Nathan nor my parents had an answer to this fundamental question. Richard cleared his throat. "I believe we need a formal audit of both the trust, accounts, and TechNexus's financials to fully assess the situation. Until that's complete, I'm placing a freeze on all trust transactions, effective immediately." You can't do that, my father protested. Actually, Edward, I can, Richard replied calmly. As a trustee with evidence of potential mismanagement, I have not only the authority, but the obligation to protect the remaining assets. As the implications of Richard's words settled over the room, I realized we had reached a turning point from which there would be no return to our previous family dynamic. The foundations of inequality that had shaped our relationships for decades were being exposed, not just to me, but to objective outside assessment. Nathan abruptly stood. This is ridiculous. I'm calling Jason Klein. Your attorney? My mother asked, looking increasingly distressed. TechNexus's attorney, Nathan clarified. This has become a hostile action against the company. As he stepped away to make the call, I turned to my parents. How did we get here? How did supporting Nathan's dreams become more important than basic honesty? My mother's eyes filled with tears. We believed in his vision. We still do. Everything we've done has been to secure both our children's futures. By sacrificing one for the other, I said softly. You've always been the practical one, my father replied, as if this explained everything. You have a stable career, a sensible approach to life. Nathan needs more support to achieve his potential. In that moment, I recognized how thoroughly I had internalized this narrative, that my reliability and practicality somehow made me less deserving of protection, less entitled to my own resources, less important to nurture. It was a perspective that had shaped not just my family's treatment of me, but my understanding of myself. As Nathan returned, his expression triumphant from whatever assurances his attorney had provided, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever resolution emerged from this painful revelation, I would never again accept that my worth was diminished by my competence, or that my future was secondary to anyone else's ambitions. The audit Richard had initiated would uncover exactly what had happened to my trust fund, but I had already discovered something more valuable: the clarity to see the patterns that had confined me and the courage to break them, regardless of the cost. The week following the confrontation at my parents' house unfolded with the strange dual reality of normalcy and upheaval. Externally, I maintained my usual routine, managing hospital operations, attending budget meetings, resolving interdepartmental conflicts. But beneath this familiar surface, everything had changed. Richard's forensic team worked with remarkable efficiency. By Wednesday, Jennifer Chen had compiled a comprehensive report documenting every transaction from my trust to TechNexus, complete, with timelines, approval signatures, and discrepancies between stated purposes and actual fund allocation. The pattern is unambiguous, Jennifer explained during our conference call. 7 distinct transfers totaling $1,396,500 were directed to TechNexus over 18 months. Each transfer was approved by both Edward and Margaret Harrington as co-trustees, with documentation describing diversified investments that never actually occurred. Richard's voice carried measured concern. The trust explicitly prohibits concentrated investment of more than 15% in any single venture, without written consent from all trustees, including myself. I never received these transactions for review, despite clear provisions requiring my signature. How was that possible? I asked. Wouldn't the bank have required proper authorization? They used a troubling workaround, Jennifer explained. Each transfer was initially directed to Harrington Financial Services, your father's consulting company, before being immediately forwarded to TechNexus. This created the appearance of diversification while obscuring the ultimate destination. The deliberate nature of the deception felt like a physical blow. Not a single impulsive decision made under pressure, but a sustained campaign of systematic redirection, carefully documented to avoid detection. What about Nathan? I asked. The documents show the funds going to TechNexus, but was he directly involved in the paperwork? Jennifer hesitated. The authorization forms were signed by your parents, not your brother. However, We found email correspondence between Nathan and your father discussing secured family investments and discrete capital transfers that align precisely with the transaction dates. So Nathan had known. Perhaps not every legal detail, but he had understood the source of his company's mysterious financial lifeline. "What are my options?" I asked, forcing myself to focus on practical next steps rather than the emotional devastation of this confirmation. "We've prepared 3 potential approaches," Richard replied. "The first is legal action to recover the misappropriated funds. Given the documentary evidence, liability is clear, but collection would be complicated by TechNexus's financial position. And it would mean publicly suing my family," I noted quietly. "Yes," Richard acknowledged. "The second option is a negotiated settlement, a formal agreement acknowledging the breach and establishing a repayment plan with appropriate security. This would provide a path to recovery while avoiding litigation." "And the third option?" "A restructuring of TechNexus with you as a major equity holder proportionate to your trust's contribution. This would convert the misappropriated funds into a legitimate investment, potentially preserving their value if the company succeeds while giving you appropriate control." None of these options addressed the fundamental breach of trust that had occurred, but they at least offered practical paths forward. I agreed to consider each approach while Richard's team continued gathering information about TechNexus's current financial position and prospects. That evening, my father called. His typically authoritative tone had been replaced by something closer to conciliation. "Eliza, this situation has gotten out of hand," he began. "I understand you're upset about how the trust investments were documented, but escalating to formal audits and freezing accounts isn't helping anyone." "The documentation isn't the issue, Dad," I replied calmly. "It's the systematic transfer of my trust fund to Nathan's company without my knowledge or consent. We made investment decisions we believed would benefit both our children," he insisted, repeating my mother's earlier justification. "Nathan's success would have created opportunities for everyone. That should have been my decision to make," I said. "The trust was established for my future, not as a family slush fund for Nathan's ventures." My father's sigh carried decades of unspoken expectations. "You've always been the practical one, Eliza. You have stable employment, reasonable needs. Nathan's vision requires greater resources to achieve its potential." "That doesn't entitle him to my inheritance," I replied, the words emerging with a clarity I had never before allowed myself. "My practicality doesn't make me less deserving of what Grandma and Grandpa left for me." "Of course not," he backpedaled. "But family supports each other. Your mother and I invested our retirement savings in TechNexus too. We're all committed to Nathan's success." "The difference," I pointed out, "is that you chose to invest your money. Mine was taken without my knowledge." The conversation continued, in circles, my father alternating between downplaying the severity of their actions and appealing to family loyalty, while I maintained the fundamental distinction between chosen support and concealed appropriation. We ended at an impasse, with my father finally suggesting we take a step back and reconsider positions before irreparable damage is done. The implied threat was clear. Pursuing accountability might permanently fracture our family. 2 days. Later, I received an unexpected text from Nathan asking to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Nathan was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, looking uncharacteristically subdued. The confident sparkle that typically animated his features had dimmed, replaced by shadows of stress beneath his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said as I sat across from him. "I thought we should talk, just the two of us, without lawyers or accountants." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I want you to understand the bigger picture," he began earnestly. "TechNexus isn't just another startup. We're developing technology that could literally save millions of lives through early detection of disease patterns. I'm not questioning. The technology's potential, I replied. I'm questioning the decision to fund it with my trust without my knowledge. That was handled poorly, Nathan conceded, the closest he had come to acknowledging wrongdoing. Mom and Dad made administrative decisions about the funding structure, but the intention was always positive. This wasn't about taking from you. It was about creating something transformative that would benefit everyone, including you. If the investment was so obviously beneficial, why not approach me directly? Why create fictional diversification documentation? Nathan shifted uncomfortably. The funding landscape has been challenging. We needed to move quickly to maintain development momentum. There wasn't time for extended family discussions about investment philosophy. There wasn't time for basic honesty, I challenged. It was a judgment call made under pressure, he replied defensively. But focusing on how it happened isn't productive now. What matters is finding a path forward that works for everyone. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Nathan leaned forward, his expression brightening with familiar persuasive energy. Join TechNexus officially. We'll formalize your position as a major investor with appropriate equity and board representation. You'd have visibility into operations and influence over major decisions. Converting the misappropriated funds into a legitimate investment after the fact, I summarized. Exactly. Nathan smiled, mistaking my understanding for agreement. It's the perfect solution. You become part of something extraordinary instead of battling over past decisions that can't be undone. The money's already been deployed into development. Extracting it now would essentially destroy the value that's been created. His proposal mirrored Richard's third option, but with a crucial difference in framing. Where Richard had presented equity conversion as a pragmatic recovery strategy, Nathan positioned it as an exciting opportunity I should be grateful to access. And what about accountability for the deception? I asked. The deliberate concealment of transactions? The violation of trust provisions? Nathan's expression hardened slightly. Dwelling on those aspects serves no one. Mom and Dad made technical errors in documentation, but their intentions were to support both their children's futures. This path forward acknowledges your rightful position while preserving the value of the investment. It also absolves everyone of responsibility, I noted. It offers resolution without destruction, he countered. The alternative is protracted legal battles that would devastate this family and likely destroy TechNexus before it can fulfill its potential. Nobody wins in that scenario. As Nathan continued outlining his vision of harmonious resolution, I observed him with new clarity. His charisma and conviction remained compelling, but I now recognized the subtle manipulation beneath the surface, the implied equivalence between documentation, technicalities, and systematic deception, the characterization of accountability as destructive rather than necessary, the positioning of his needs as universally beneficial, while mine were portrayed as narrowly self-interested. I need to consider all options, I said when he finally paused. Richard's team is still completing their assessment of TechNexus's current position and prospects. Nathan's smile tightened. Richard has clearly overstepped his role as a supporting trustee. He's encouraging conflict rather than facilitating resolution. He's fulfilling his fiduciary responsibility, I corrected. He's creating unnecessary drama over administrative details, Nathan insisted. This situation needs a family solution, not outside interference. When I didn't immediately agree, Nathan shifted tactics. Mom is devastated by all this, you know. She's barely sleeping, convinced her children are being turned against each other by lawyers who don't understand our family dynamics. The attempt at emotional leverage might have worked in the past, triggering my ingrained pattern of accommodation to maintain family harmony. Now, it simply confirmed how thoroughly manipulation had been normalized in our relationships. I'll consider your proposal alongside the other options, I said, rising to leave. But I need complete transparency about TechNexus's current financial position and prospects before making any decision. Nathan's expression revealed fleeting frustration before resuming its persuasive earnestness. Of course, I'll have our CFO prepare a comprehensive overview. You'll see we're on the verge of extraordinary breakthroughs. As I walked away from the coffee shop, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. The patterns of our family dynamic were now glaringly obvious. Nathan's needs consistently prioritized, his ambitions framed as collective benefits, his failures recast as temporary setbacks on the path to inevitable success. My role had always been to support, accommodate, and sacrifice when necessary, all while being characterized as practical rather than visionary. What Nathan and my parents couldn't comprehend was that their actions had irreversibly shifted my perspective. Even if TechNexus miraculously became the success they promised, even if my trust fund's value was eventually restored or multiplied, the fundamental breach could not be undone. They had betrayed not just financial obligations, but the basic trust that families are built upon. The following morning, Richard called with news that would dramatically impact our next steps. Jennifer's team has completed their analysis of TechNexus's current financial position. He began carefully. The situation is more concerning than initially understood. How much worse? I asked, bracing myself. TechNexus has accumulated approximately $8 million in debt beyond the capital from your trust and your parents' investments. Their monthly burn rate has increased to nearly $230,000 with minimal revenue generation. Most concerning, they've missed their last 2 payroll tax deposits. The implications were clear. Nathan's company wasn't merely struggling, it was approaching insolvency. There's more, Richard continued. The clinical validation study they've been promoting to potential investors has shown disappointing preliminary results. The algorithm's predictive accuracy is significantly below the benchmarks they claimed in their investor presentations. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing this final confirmation. So not only did they take my trust fund without permission, they invested it in a company that's failing both financially and technologically. Based on the current trajectory, TechNexus will exhaust all remaining capital within 45-60 days, Richard confirmed. Without substantial new investment or dramatic restructuring, bankruptcy appears inevitable. The conversation with Nathan the previous day took on new significance. His urgency in securing my agreement wasn't about inclusion or resolution. It was a desperate attempt to prevent me from recovering what remained of my funds before the company collapsed completely. What's my best option now? I asked, pushing aside the emotional weight to focus on practical recovery. Given these findings, our recommendation has changed, Richard replied. We should immediately petition the court for emergency injunctive relief to freeze TechNexus's remaining assets, while pursuing claims against both the company and the trustees who facilitated these transfers. Time is of the essence. The decision before me was now clearer but more painful. Taking the recommended legal action meant not just confronting my family's betrayal, but potentially accelerating TechNexus's collapse and my parents' financial distress given their own investments in the company. Yet the alternative, continuing to accommodate deception and mismanagement, would mean accepting the complete loss of my inheritance and reinforcing the family dynamic that had allowed this situation to develop. Proceed with the emergency. Petition, I told Richard, my voice steadier than I expected. And prepare formal notices to my parents and Nathan outlining the claims and potential paths to resolution that don't involve litigation. As I ended the call, I recognized that I had reached the point of no return. The attempted intervention, my parents' hastily arranged meeting to secure my agreement, Nathan's persuasive coffee shop proposal, the emotional appeals to family loyalty, had failed to deflect me from seeking accountability. What they had failed to understand was that this wasn't about money anymore. It was about recognizing my own worth and refusing to accept that my future was less deserving of protection than my brother's ambitions. It was about establishing that my practicality didn't make me an acceptable sacrifice on the altar of Nathan's vision. The legal proceedings would be painful, the family fractures possibly permanent. But continuing to accommodate the patterns that had led to this betrayal would exact an even greater cost, the surrender of my autonomy and self-respect. As I prepared for the difficult days ahead, I felt an unexpected sense of certainty. Whatever happened with the trust funds, whatever became of TechNexus, I had already reclaimed something more valuable, the conviction that my life and future mattered, not as a supporting character in someone else's story, but as the protagonist of my own. Richard's legal team moved with impressive efficiency. By the following afternoon, they had filed an emergency petition with the court seeking to freeze TechNexus's remaining assets and prevent any further dispersal of funds. The accompanying documentation was comprehensive: detailed transaction records, trust provisions that had been violated, and Jennifer Chen's forensic analysis demonstrating the systematic nature of the misappropriation. I received the court's preliminary order granting the asset freeze at work, the notification appearing on my phone during a budget meeting with hospital department heads. I maintained my professional composure through the remainder of the meeting, discussing resource allocations and staffing projections with practiced precision, while my personal life unraveled in text messages and emails accumulating on my silenced phone. When the meeting finally concluded, I retreated to my office and closed the door before reviewing the notifications. There were 7 missed calls from my mother, 3 from my father, and a series of increasingly agitated texts from Nathan. "What have you done? The company accounts are frozen. Do you realize you're destroying everything we've built? Call me immediately." I set my phone aside without responding and turned instead to the email from Richard confirming the court's decision. The order prohibited TechNexus from transferring or dispersing any funds exceeding $5,000 without court approval, effectively halting normal business operations until a hearing scheduled for the following week. A separate email contained formal notices that had been delivered to my parents and Nathan, outlining the claims against them and proposing settlement options that could potentially resolve the matter without full litigation. These options included: 1. Immediate return of all recoverable funds from TechNexus to my trust. 2. Transfer of personal assets from my parents and/or Nathan to compensate for misappropriated funds. 3. Restructuring of TechNexus with majority ownership. Transferred to my trust in proportion to the total contribution. Each option acknowledged the reality that most of the funds had already been spent on TechNexus's operations and might not be directly recoverable. But each also required my family to acknowledge their violation of fiduciary duty and accept meaningful consequences, rather than simply legitimizing their actions after the fact. As I contemplated these developments, my office phone rang. It was Dr. Winters, the hospital's chief medical officer and my direct supervisor. "Eliza, do you have a moment to stop by my office?" His tone was carefully neutral, raising immediate concerns. 10 minutes later, I sat across from Dr. Winters, whose expression conveyed uncomfortable awareness of my personal situation. I received a call from Jason Klein, legal counsel for TechNexus Technologies. He began carefully. He indicated that Meridian Healthcare might become entangled in a personal legal dispute involving you and your family's company. I maintained my professional demeanor, despite the shock of this unexpected intersection between my work and personal crisis. "I apologize for any awkwardness this has created, Dr. Winters. I've been careful to keep the matter entirely separate from my professional responsibilities." "I understand," he nodded. "However, Mr. Klein suggested that your position here at Meridian could represent a conflict of interest given TechNexus's healthcare focus and potential future partnerships with hospital systems." The implication was clear. Nathan was leveraging his company's industry connections to pressure me through my employer. It was a desperate tactic that revealed how seriously he viewed the asset freeze. "There is no conflict of interest," I stated firmly. The legal matter involves trust fund, mismanagement, not healthcare technology, and Meridian has no existing or planned relationship with TechNexus. Dr. Winters looked relieved. That's consistent with our records. I assured Mr. Klein that we have thorough conflict of interest protocols and found no issues with your position. Here. He paused. Eliza, I want to be clear that Meridian values your contributions. This call appeared to be an attempt at inappropriate pressure, which we don't condone. His support was unexpected and deeply appreciated. Thank you, Dr. Winters. I'll ensure this personal matter continues to have zero impact on my work here. As I left his office, a new understanding crystallized. Nathan's willingness to potentially damage my professional reputation demonstrated that no aspect of my life was sacred in his pursuit of continued funding. The boundary between family financial conflicts and my career had been breached without hesitation. That evening, as I entered my apartment building, the concierge called out to me. Ms. Harrington, your parents have been waiting in the lobby for almost 2 hours. I explained you weren't home, but they insisted on staying. Indeed, my mother and father sat in the lobby's waiting area, looking simultaneously out of place and determined. My mother rose immediately upon seeing me, her expression a complex mixture of anger and distress. We need to talk, she said without preamble. What you've done is destroying this family. The lobby was too public for this conversation. Despite my reluctance, I escorted them to my apartment, maintaining silence until we were behind closed doors. You filed a lawsuit against your own family, my father began once we were inside. Do you have any concept of what that means, the damage it's causing? I filed for emergency protection of remaining assets, I corrected calmly, after discovering systematic misappropriation of my trust fund. This legal terminology is exactly the problem, my mother interjected. You're reducing family relationships to cold financial transactions. We made investment decisions with everyone's best interests in mind. You made decisions with Nathan's interests in mind, I countered, and deliberately concealed them from me. My father paced the living room, agitation evident in every movement. TechNexus is facing immediate shutdown because of your actions. Employees will lose their jobs. The technology they've developed will be abandoned, all because you couldn't see beyond narrow self-interest. The familiar pattern of characterizing my concerns as selfish, while Nathan's needs were framed as universally beneficial, no longer had the power to sway me. The company is facing shutdown because it's financially unsustainable, and the technology hasn't met its development milestones. My actions simply revealed the inevitable reality sooner. That's not true, my mother protested. Nathan was close to securing new investors. This legal action has scared them away. According to Jennifer Chen's analysis, TechNexus has missed payroll tax deposits and significantly underperformed on its clinical validation benchmarks, I replied. These facts would have deterred any serious investor regardless of legal proceedings. My father's expression darkened. So you've had accountants digging through a private company's records, looking for problems to justify your actions. I had professionals assess exactly what happened to $1. $4 million of my trust fund that was transferred without my knowledge, I clarified. The company's performance issues were relevant to that assessment. My mother sat heavily on my couch, sudden tears welling in her eyes. This is destroying our family. Nathan isn't sleeping. Your father's blood pressure is dangerously elevated. Is that what you wanted? The emotional appeal struck home as intended, triggering the caretaker instinct I had cultivated throughout my life. For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of responsibility for others' well-being, the instinct to set aside my own interests to restore family harmony. But something had fundamentally shifted within me. While I felt genuine compassion for my parents' distress, I recognized it as a consequence of their own actions rather than my responsibility to remedy at my expense. I understand this is difficult, I said, my voice gentler but still resolute. But the situation was created when you decided to redirect my trust fund without my knowledge. The current legal action is simply addressing that reality. We can still fix this, my father insisted. If you withdraw the court petition and work with us on a family solution, TechNexus might still be saved. I've proposed 3 potential resolutions that don't involve full litigation, I noted. Richard sent them to you this morning. My father dismissed this with a wave. Those options all involve admitting wrongdoing and surrendering assets. That's not resolution. It's capitulation. It's accountability, I corrected. Resolution requires acknowledging what happened and taking responsibility for it. My mother looked up, tears streaming down her face. We were trying to support both our children. Everything we did was out of love for this family. The sincerity of her distress was undeniable, and I realized that in her worldview, she had been acting out of genuine conviction that Nathan's success would benefit everyone. The fundamental error wasn't malice, but a profound imbalance in how she valued our respective futures and autonomy. I believe you thought you were doing the right thing, I acknowledged, but you made decisions about my future without my consent or knowledge. You prioritized Nathan's ambitions over my financial security. That fundamental imbalance has shaped our family dynamic my entire life. My father started to protest, but I continued with newfound clarity. The practical daughter who gets overlooked because her accomplishments seem less dazzling. The reliable one whose needs matter less because she doesn't demand attention. The supportive sister expected to sacrifice for her brother's dreams. I met their eyes directly. I've accepted that role my entire life, but I can't do it anymore. A heavy silence filled the apartment as my parents confronted this direct challenge to the family narrative they had constructed and maintained for decades. "What exactly do you want?" my father finally asked, his tone suggesting surrender. Rather than understanding, "I want acknowledgement of what happened. I want protecting what remains of my trust fund. And I want you to recognize that my future isn't secondary to Nathan's ambitions. And if we agree to this..." "Acknowledgement," my mother ventured carefully. "Would you drop the legal proceedings? If we can reach a formal agreement that addresses the misappropriation and provides security for any potential recovery, yes, I would prefer resolution without extended litigation." They exchanged glances, communicating silently in the way of long-married couples. "We'll need to discuss this with Nathan," my father said finally. "He needs to be part of the solution," I agreed. "But the resolution can't be simply continuing on the current path with my formal consent added retroactively." As they prepared to leave, my mother embraced me awkwardly. "I never meant to make you feel less important," she whispered. "You were always so capable, so independent. I thought you didn't need the support Nathan did." Her words carried genuine remorse, but also revealed the fundamental misconception that had shaped our relationship, confusing self-sufficiency with diminished need for recognition and protection. My competence had become the justification for directing family resources elsewhere, creating a perverse incentive structure where capability was effectively penalized. After they departed, I stood in my quiet apartment, experiencing a sense of clarity that transcended the specific financial dispute. The confrontation had forced explicit acknowledgement of patterns that had operated beneath the surface throughout my life, patterns I had accepted as natural law rather than questioning their validity or impact. The path ahead remained uncertain. There was no guarantee my family would agree to meaningful resolution, and pursuing legal remedies might permanently fracture relationships built over decades. But something irreversible had shifted within me, a recognition that accommodating imbalance wasn't an expression of love, but a surrender of selfhood. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time since childhood, articulating truths I had long suppressed. My practicality doesn't make me less deserving of protection. My reliability doesn't obligate me to sacrifice for others' dreams. My independence doesn't mean I need less recognition or support. These weren't selfish declarations, but necessary recalibrations, the establishment of boundaries that should have existed all along. Whatever resolution emerged from the current crisis, these truths would guide my decisions moving forward, not just in relation to my family, but in every aspect of my life. The invisible breaking point had finally been reached, not with dramatic confrontation or emotional outburst, but with the quiet certainty that I would no longer be defined by others' expectations or diminished by my own competence. The path this realization would ultimately lead me down remained unclear, but for the first time, I would be walking it on my own terms. 3 days after my parents' visit, with the court hearing approaching, I received an unexpected email from Jason Klein, TechNexus's attorney. The message was brief, but carried significant implications. In the interest of all parties, we propose a confidential mediation session prior to next week's hearing. Please advise if your counsel is amenable to this approach. I forwarded the email to Richard, who called within the hour. This suggests they recognize their position is weaker than they initially believed, he observed. Mediation could be productive, provided it's properly structured with full financial transparency. Do you think it's a genuine attempt at resolution or a delay tactic? I asked. Likely both, Richard replied pragmatically. The asset freeze has created immediate operational challenges for TechNexus. They need a resolution, but they'll also be strategizing to minimize accountability and financial consequences. After discussing parameters, Richard agreed to arrange a mediation session with all relevant parties, my parents as co-trustees, Nathan as TechNexus's CEO, Klein as corporate counsel, and Jennifer Chen to provide financial analysis. The session was scheduled for Friday morning at a neutral conference facility, giving both sides 2 days to prepare. I used that time methodically, approaching the situation with the same analytical rigor I applied to hospital operations challenges. While Richard's team handled legal preparations, I focused on clarifying my own priorities and boundaries. This wasn't merely about financial recovery. It was about establishing a new framework for my relationship with my family, one based on mutual respect rather than habitual accommodation. I developed a structured document outlining 3 categories of consideration: non-negotiable elements, formal acknowledgement of fiduciary breach by my parents, immediate protection of remaining trust assets, transparent, accounting of all transactions and current financial status, meaningful consequences for misappropriation, preferred outcomes, maximum recovery of diverted funds, clear boundaries for future financial independence, restoration of family relationships with new, healthier dynamics, resolution without protracted litigation, acceptable compromises, structured repayment plans with reasonable timeframes, partial recovery through equity conversion if supported by genuine business, viability, phased implementation of accountability measures, third-party oversight of any continuing financial interconnections. This framework provided clarity about where I could be flexible and where I needed to maintain firm boundaries. It transformed an emotionally charged situation into a structured problem-solving exercise, a context where my natural analytical strengths could serve me rather than being used against me. The morning of the mediation, I dressed with deliberate care, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that projected both professionalism and authority. My typical workday attire was similarly formal, but this outfit had been specifically chosen to convey that I was approaching this session as an equal participant with legitimate interests to protect, not as the accommodating daughter or sister who could be persuaded to prioritize others' needs. The conference facility occupied the 12th floor of a downtown office building, its neutral beige decor and panoramic city views providing an appropriately businesslike setting for the discussion. Richard and Jennifer met me in the lobby, reviewing last-minute details before we ascended together. "Remember," Richard advised as the elevator climbed, The mediator's role is facilitation, not judgment. Focus on addressing the other parties directly about what you need and why. Emotional appeals will likely feature prominently in their approach. Maintain your focus on the substantive issues. The mediator, a retired judge named Eleanor Phillips, greeted us at the conference room door. Inside, my parents and Nathan were already seated on one side of a long mahogany table, with Jason Klein positioned protectively beside them. My mother appeared visibly distressed, while my father maintained rigid composure. Nathan looked simultaneously defiant and exhausted, the strain of recent events evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. Judge Phillips began with a concise overview of the mediation process and objectives before inviting opening statements. Klein spoke first, characterizing the situation as an unfortunate family miscommunication about investment strategies that had been unnecessarily escalated through legal intervention. Richard's response was measured but pointed. This is not a case of miscommunication, but documented misappropriation. Over $1.4 million was systematically transferred from Ms. Harrington's trust fund to TechNexus through deliberately obscured transactions. This mediation is an opportunity to acknowledge those facts and develop appropriate remedies. The opening exchanges established the fundamental tension that would characterize the entire session. Klein and my family positioning the situation as an internal family matter best resolved through mutual accommodation, while Richard maintained focus on the documented fiduciary violations and need for substantive accountability. Judge Phillips then invited me to speak directly about my concerns and objectives. I had prepared this statement carefully, reviewing it multiple times to ensure it conveyed both emotional truth and factual accuracy. For most of my life, I began, my voice steadier than I had anticipated, I've accepted a family dynamic where Nathan's ambitions took priority over my needs. I've been characterized as the practical one, with the implication that my reliability somehow made me less deserving of support or protection. My mother shifted uncomfortably, while Nathan's expression remained carefully neutral. When my grandparents established identical trusts for both their grandchildren, they created equal foundations for our futures. Over the past 18 months, that equality was systematically dismantled through concealed transactions that prioritized Nathan's business ventures over my financial security. I directed my gaze specifically at my parents. This wasn't a miscommunication or a technical oversight. It was a deliberate decision to redirect my inheritance without my knowledge or consent, documented with misleading descriptions specifically designed to prevent detection. My father started to interject, but Judge Phillips gently indicated he should allow me to finish. I'm here today because I want resolution, not retribution. I want acknowledgement of what happened, protection of what remains, and a framework for moving forward that respects my autonomy. But that resolution must address the fundamental breach of trust that occurred, not simply legitimize it after the fact. When I finished, a heavy silence settled over the room. My direct articulation of both the financial violations and the deeper pattern they represented had shifted the emotional dynamics. The familiar script where my concerns could be minimized or reframed as selfishness was no longer functioning effectively. Judge Phillips then invited responses, beginning with my parents. My father spoke first, his typical authoritative tone, noticeably subdued. We never intended to harm Eliza's interests, he began. Every decision was made with the conviction that Nathan's company represented an extraordinary opportunity that would ultimately benefit the entire family. The documentation issues were administrative oversights, not deliberate deception. The characterization rang hollow against the detailed records Jennifer had compiled, which clearly demonstrated systematic efforts to obscure the transaction's true nature and destination. My mother added her perspective next, emotion evident in her wavering voice. We love both our children equally. Nathan's ventures simply required more active support due to their innovative nature and potential impact. Eliza's stability and self-sufficiency seemed like strengths, not reasons to provide less support. This inadvertent confirmation of the fundamental imbalance in how they perceived and treated us was striking. In their worldview, my independence had become justification for directing resources elsewhere, rather than evidence of success to be equally celebrated and protected. Nathan spoke last among the family members. I've always believed TechNexus would create value far beyond the initial investment. The company isn't just my personal project, it's developing technology with life-saving potential. The current financial challenges are temporary setbacks in pursuit of that greater mission. His familiar framing of personal ambition as universal benefit continued even in this context, though with notably less conviction than usual. The asset freeze and pending court hearing had punctured his characteristic certainty, revealing the vulnerability beneath the charismatic confidence. Judge Phillips then directed the conversation toward specific proposals for resolution. Klein presented a three-part approach that effectively legitimized the past transactions while making minimal concessions. 1. Formal documentation of the trust's investment in TechNexus with appropriate equity allocation. 2. Structured governance. Changes giving me observer status on the company's board. 3. Priority repayment provisions. If the company reached profitability, Richard countered with our more substantive framework, emphasizing 1. Explicit acknowledgement of fiduciary breach by the trustees. 2. Immediate protection of remaining trust assets through formal separation. 3. Security arrangements for potential recovery using personal assets as collateral. 4. Independent oversight of any continuing financial interconnections. The gulf between these positions led to hours of detailed negotiation, with Judge Phillips skillfully guiding the conversation toward potential areas of compromise. Throughout this process, I maintained both composure and clarity about my priorities, neither yielding on fundamental principles nor insisting on punitive measures that would serve no constructive purpose. By mid-afternoon, the outlines of a potential resolution began to emerge. My parents reluctantly acknowledged their breach of fiduciary duty, though framing it as procedural failures rather than intentional misconduct. In exchange for withdrawing the court petition, they agreed to 1. Transfer personal assets, including their vacation property, to a recovery trust as security for partial repayment. 2. Relinquish all trustee authority over my remaining trust funds, with Richard becoming sole trustee until my 30th birthday. 3. Provide full financial transparency regarding TechNexus's operations and prospects. The most challenging aspect involved Nathan and TechNexus. The company's precarious financial position meant immediate fund recovery was impossible without triggering bankruptcy. After extensive discussion of options, we developed a structured approach. 1. Conversion of the misappropriated funds into formal equity ownership proportionate to the total investment. 2. Implementation of professional financial controls, including an independent CFO. 3. Explicit milestones for technology development and market validation. 4. A structured exit mechanism if the company failed to meet performance targets. This arrangement wasn't ideal from a pure recovery perspective, but it represented a pragmatic approach that balanced accountability with the practical realities of the situation. The independent financial controls would prevent further mismanagement, while the formal equity position and exit provisions created a potential path to partial recovery if the company eventually succeeded. As the session concluded and formal documentation was prepared, Judge Phillips arranged for private conversations between the parties. My parents approached me first, their expressions revealing a complex mixture of relief, remorse, and lingering resentment at being held accountable. "We never meant to hurt you," my mother said quietly. "We genuinely believed we were making decisions that would benefit everyone." "I understand that was your intention," I replied, "but good intentions don't negate the impact of treating my inheritance as a resource for Nathan's pursuits without my knowledge or consent." My father nodded slowly, the familiar authoritative certainty notably absent. The mediation agreement acknowledges our errors in handling your trust. We're committed to making this right, though it will take time. I appreciate that commitment, I said. What I hope you'll also recognize is the deeper pattern this situation revealed, how my reliability and independence were used to justify directing support elsewhere, as if those qualities made me less deserving of protection. Their expressions suggested this broader perspective remained challenging for them to fully embrace, but the explicit acknowledgement of fiduciary breach represented a meaningful first step toward recognizing the imbalance that had characterized our family dynamic. Nathan approached after they stepped away, his manner uncharacteristically hesitant. "I want you to know I didn't initiate the trust transfers," he began defensively. "That was Mom and Dad's approach to funding. You knew the source of the money," I countered calmly. "The emails between you and Dad make that clear." He didn't deny this. "I believed in the company's potential. Still do. The current challenges are temporary setbacks, not fundamental flaws in the vision." His inability to acknowledge responsibility even in this context was revealing but no longer surprising. Throughout his life, Nathan had been insulated from consequential accountability, with others consistently absorbing the impact of his missteps. The mediation agreement gives TechNexus a structured path forward with proper financial controls, I noted. Whether the company succeeds will depend on actual performance against measurable benchmarks, not persuasive narratives. As we prepared to leave, Richard expressed cautious optimism about the resolution. It addresses the fundamental legal issues while creating mechanisms for potential recovery. More importantly, it establishes boundaries and accountability frameworks that didn't exist before. Jennifer Chen was more measured in her assessment. From a purely financial perspective, full recovery is unlikely given TechNexus's current position, but the secured personal assets provide meaningful protection, and the governance changes should prevent further mismanagement. I understood both perspectives. The agreement wasn't a complete victory in financial terms, but it represented something more valuable, a fundamental recalibration of relationships and expectations that had been imbalanced for decades. As I left the conference facility, I felt neither triumph nor desolation, but a quiet certainty that I had finally acted as the protagonist in my own life, rather than a supporting character in someone else's narrative. The road ahead would undoubtedly include challenges in rebuilding family relationships on more equitable terms, but for the first time, I was walking that road with clear boundaries and expectations. The silent strategist had found her voice, not through dramatic confrontation or emotional ultimatums, but through methodical analysis, clear priorities, and unwavering commitment to her own value and autonomy. It was a transformation that would reshape not just this specific situation, but every aspect of how I engaged with the world moving forward. The month following the mediation agreement unfolded along two distinct trajectories: the visible implementation of formal arrangements and the invisible internal recalibration of my approach to life. While lawyers and accountants executed the technical aspects of our settlement, I began the more profound work of redefining my identity beyond the roles I had accepted throughout my life. The formal implementation proceeded with methodical precision. Richard established a new trust structure that placed the remaining funds, approximately $980,000, under his sole trusteeship until my 30th birthday, with quarterly distributions continuing as originally intended. My parents transferred the deed to their lakeside vacation property into a recovery trust as security against the misappropriated funds, a transaction that reportedly occurred with considerable tension but eventual compliance. TechNexus underwent significant structural changes under the agreement's terms. An independent CFO with restructuring experience was appointed to implement professional financial controls and develop sustainable operational plans. Nathan remained CEO but now reported to an expanded board that included 2 independent directors with healthcare technology expertise. My equity position, formalized at 32% ownership, came with observer rights at board meetings rather than voting authority, allowing visibility without direct management involvement. These visible changes proceeded alongside a parallel journey that was equally significant, but less apparent to others. For 28 years, I had defined myself largely in relation to Nathan and my family's expectations. The practical one, the reliable one, the one who accommodated others' needs. This identity had shaped not just family dynamics, but my approach to every aspect of life, from career choices to personal relationships. The trust fund situation had forced a fundamental reassessment of this self-concept. If my practicality had been used to justify diminishing my needs and rights, perhaps other aspects of my character had been similarly misconstrued or undervalued. This realization prompted me to undertake a deliberate inventory of my authentic priorities, preferences, and aspirations, independent of the roles I had been assigned. I began with small private explorations. For years, I had maintained that I preferred practical, sensible vacations, while Nathan enjoyed exotic adventures funded by our parents. Was this genuine preference or adaptive behavior developed in response to differential treatment? To test this, I used a portion of my quarterly distribution to book a solo trip to Costa Rica, combining rainforest exploration with a retreat focused on mindfulness practices. The experience was revelatory. Far from feeling uncomfortable with adventure, I discovered a natural affinity for both physical challenges and contemplative practices. Hiking to remote waterfalls, observing wildlife in their natural habitats, and practicing meditation at sunrise revealed aspects of myself that had been submerged beneath layers of practicality. I returned with a journal filled with observations and reflections that had nothing to do with being useful to others and everything to do with authentic engagement with the world. This exploration extended to my professional life as well. At Meridian Healthcare, I had built my reputation on solving problems others created or overlooked, essentially replicating my family role in the workplace. While this approach had earned me respect, it had also established expectations that I would consistently prioritize organizational needs over personal boundaries. 3 weeks after the mediation, an opportunity arose to test a different approach. The hospital's executive committee proposed a major electronic health record system conversion with an aggressive 6-month implementation timeline. As operations manager, I would be expected to coordinate the transition while maintaining normal operational functions, effectively doubling my workload without additional resources or compensation. In the past, I would have accepted this challenge, without question, working nights and weekends to make the impossible happen while others received credit for the initiative's success. Instead, I prepared a detailed analysis of resource requirements and implementation risks, concluding with a clear recommendation: either extend the timeline to 12 months or provide a dedicated project team to support the transition. Presenting. This analysis to the executive committee required a different kind of courage than confronting my family. Professional reputation rather than personal relationships was at stake, and my identity as the person who made impossible things happen was deeply ingrained in my workplace persona. The 6-month timeline creates significant operational risks that could affect patient care, I explained, maintaining calm confidence despite internal nervousness. I've outlined 2 viable approaches that would achieve the desired outcome without compromising core functions or burning out staff. Dr. Winters studied my analysis with thoughtful consideration. This is characteristically thorough, Eliza. You've anticipated problems most of us hadn't considered. He turned to the committee. I recommend we adopt Ms. Harrington's 12-month implementation plan with the phased approach she's outlined. The committee's approval was unanimous. More surprising was the conversation with Dr. Winters afterward, when he noted, "You've always delivered exceptional results, but this kind of proactive boundary setting is equally valuable. We rely on your judgment about what's feasible, not just your ability to handle whatever we throw at you." His feedback crystallized something I had been learning through the trust fund situation. that establishing clear boundaries wasn't selfish or limiting, but essential for sustainable success and authentic contribution. The person who makes reasonable demands based on professional judgment earns different respect than the one who accommodates unreasonable expectations without question. These parallel journeys, the formal implementation of the mediation agreement, and my internal recalibration, occasionally intersected in unexpected ways. 5 weeks after the mediation, Nathan requested a meeting to discuss TechNexus's progress under the new structure. We met at a restaurant equidistant from our respective offices, the neutral location symbolic of our evolving relationship. Nathan arrived precisely on time, another subtle shift from his previous pattern of casual lateness that had implicitly communicated his time was more valuable than mine. His demeanor combined familiar charismatic energy with newfound restraint, as if testing which aspects of his approach would be effective in our reconfigured relationship. "The new CFO is implementing significant changes," he began after preliminary pleasantries. "Operational costs have been reduced by nearly 30% while maintaining core development functions." "That's substantial," I acknowledged. "What impact is it having on technology development timelines?" "We've had to prioritize more rigorously," Nathan admitted. "Some secondary features have been deferred to focus resources on perfecting the core predictive algorithm. The independent directors have been particularly helpful in identifying which capabilities matter most to potential healthcare clients." This acknowledgement of external expertise shaping his vision represented noteworthy evolution from his previous resistance to practical constraints. Whether this change reflected genuine growth or strategic adaptation to new governance realities remained to be seen, but the behavioral shift itself was significant. "The board is considering a potential strategic partnership with Corinth Medical Systems," Nathan continued. "They have complementary technology and established hospital relationships that could accelerate market entry. As a major equity holder, your perspective would be valuable." The invitation to provide substantive input, rather than mere supportive encouragement, marked another shift in our interaction pattern. "I'd need to review the detailed proposal and Corinth's market position before offering any specific recommendation," I replied. "But conceptually, strategic partnerships often make sense for healthcare technology deployment, particularly for navigating complex institutional adoption processes." Nathan nodded, making notes rather than dismissing my caution as excessive analysis. "I'll have the proposal documentation sent to you and Richard this week. The independent directors are conducting due diligence on Corinth's technology and financials before formal discussions begin." Throughout the meal, our conversation maintained this new equilibrium, Nathan sharing information without excessive promotional framing, me offering substantive input without automatic accommodation. We were finding our way toward a relationship, based on mutual respect rather than established hierarchies, though the transition remained awkward at times as we navigated unfamiliar interactional territory. As we prepared to leave, Nathan addressed the deeper implications of our changed circumstances. "I've been thinking about what you said during the mediation, about how the family dynamic always prioritized my pursuits over your needs. I didn't see it that way at the time, but the past few weeks have been illuminating." I waited silently, allowing him space to continue without guidance or reassurance. "The independent directors and CFO ask questions I can't deflect with vision, statements, or charismatic promises," he said with a rueful smile. "They require substantive answers backed by evidence. It's challenging but ultimately strengthening the company's foundation. I'm starting to understand what you meant about the difference between inspiring narratives and sustainable plans." This insight, limited though it might be, suggested potential for growth beyond the patterns that had defined him throughout his life. "It's significant that you recognize that distinction," I acknowledged. "Compelling vision and practical execution aren't opposing forces. They're complementary elements of sustainable success, which is why we should have been true partners all along, rather than me dismissing your perspective as unnecessarily cautious," Nathan offered, the observation seemingly genuine despite coming years too late. As we parted, I recognized that our paths would continue to run parallel rather than fully converging, connected by family history and current financial entanglements, but fundamentally distinct in direction and purpose. The mediation agreement hadn't repaired all that had been broken, but it had established a framework for more balanced engagement moving forward. My parents' adaptation to the new reality proved more challenging. Their weekly calls maintained superficial pleasantries while carefully avoiding substantive discussion of either the trust situation or the deeper patterns it had revealed. When financial matters required attention, they directed questions to Richard rather than engaging directly, as if the formal structure could somehow contain the emotional implications of what had occurred. 2 months after the mediation, my mother suggested Sunday dinner to reconnect as a family. The invitation carried implicit expectations of returned normalcy, that having resolved the legal technicalities, we could resume familiar patterns without addressing their underlying imbalance. After careful consideration, I proposed an alternative. Lunch at a restaurant rather than the loaded setting of the family home, and without Nathan present for this initial reconnection. The lunch was predictably strained. My mother made valiant efforts at conventional conversation, updates on extended family, local news, insignificant anecdotes, while my father maintained polite but distant engagement. Beneath the surface platitudes ran powerful currents of unresolved emotion, their lingering resentment at being held accountable, my vigilance against returning to established patterns, our collective uncertainty about what this relationship could become without its familiar foundation of predetermined roles. Toward the meal's end, my mother finally broached the elephant in the room. "We miss how things used to be, Eliza. This formality between us feels so unnecessary among family." "What specifically do you miss?" I asked gently but directly. The question visibly startled her. "Just the natural connection. The comfort of being together without all these new barriers." "The comfort came from predictable roles," I observed. "I accommodated, supported, and never challenged the established order. That pattern felt natural because we'd practiced it my entire life, but it wasn't healthy or balanced." My father's expression tightened. "So now we're required to walk on eggshells, monitoring every interaction for perceived imbalances?" "Not at all," I replied, maintaining composed directness. "I'm simply suggesting that building a healthier relationship requires acknowledging the patterns that damaged the previous one. Discomfort is part of genuine growth." The conversation didn't produce dramatic breakthroughs or tearful reconciliations. Instead, it established a precedent for direct communication without either hostility or artificial harmony, a foundation for potential growth rather than immediate resolution. As I navigated these parallel paths of external implementation and internal recalibration, I found myself developing new clarity about both past patterns and future possibilities. The person who had accepted diminishment to maintain family harmony was evolving into someone who could establish boundaries without apology and pursue authentic aspirations without seeking permission or approval. This evolution wasn't without challenges. Decades of ingrained patterns didn't disappear through simple awareness, and I occasionally caught myself slipping into automatic accommodation or unnecessary justification of my needs. But each recognition of these habitual responses became an opportunity for conscious realignment with my emerging authentic self. The most profound shift wasn't in specific behaviors, but in fundamental perspective. I was learning to view myself not as a supporting character in others' narratives, but as the protagonist of my own life, responsible for defining its direction, establishing its boundaries, and determining its priorities based on internal values, rather than external expectations. This parallel journey of external resolution and internal transformation was creating something neither my family nor I could have anticipated when the trust fund discrepancies first emerged: a new identity, based not on reaction to established patterns, but on deliberate creation of authentic purpose and value. 3 months after the mediation agreement, the carefully constructed equilibrium between implementing formal arrangements and rebuilding personal relationships was shattered by an unexpected development that would accelerate my journey in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The morning began routinely enough. I arrived at Meridian Healthcare at 7:30 a.m. to prepare for our quarterly performance review with the executive committee. As operations manager, I had compiled comprehensive data on departmental efficiencies, staffing optimizations, and patient satisfaction metrics, all showing significant improvements under the measured implementation plan I had advocated for, rather than the rushed timeline originally proposed. I was reviewing my presentation one final time when my assistant appeared at my office door, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Eliza, there's someone from the Department of Justice here to see you. She says it's urgent and personal." I set down my tablet, momentarily disoriented by this unexpected interruption. The Department of Justice? Did she provide identification? "Yes, Special Agent Teresa Morales. She's waiting in the small conference room." My mind raced through possibilities as I walked down the corridor. Had something happened with the trust arrangement? Was there some legal complication with the mediation agreement? The involvement of a federal agency suggested something far more serious than routine follow-up. Agent Morales stood as I entered the conference room. She was a composed woman in her 40s, her government credentials displayed professionally as she introduced herself. "Ms. Harrington, thank you for making time. I understand this is unexpected. I'm leading an investigation into financial irregularities at TechNexus Technologies and several related entities." The statement landed with seismic impact. "Financial irregularities beyond what was identified in our recent legal proceedings?" "Yes. Our investigation predates your family's mediation agreement by several months. We've been tracking a pattern of potentially fraudulent activities involving healthcare technology startups, including TechNexus." She placed a thin folder on the table between us. "We have reason to believe you were unknowingly involved through the misappropriation of your trust assets." She opened the folder, revealing documents I recognized from Richard's forensic investigation, along with additional materials I hadn't seen before. "Our investigation indicates that TechNexus may have been part of a sophisticated scheme to obtain investment capital through misrepresented technological capabilities and fabricated client commitments. The implications were staggering. Beyond the breach of fiduciary duty I had already confronted, this suggested potential criminal fraud." "Are you saying TechNexus's technology doesn't work?" "The company's central claim, predictive healthcare, algorithms with 87% accuracy, appears to be substantially exaggerated based on independent expert assessment. The clinical validation studies cited in investor materials were either manipulated or completely fabricated." Each word struck with physical force. Not only had my trust fund been diverted without my knowledge, but it had been invested in a venture built on fundamental misrepresentations. "We're particularly interested in communications between Nathan Harrington and several key investors, including documentation provided to your parents to justify the trust fund transfers," Agent Morales continued. "We'd like to understand what you were told about TechNexus's technology and market position." I took a steadying breath. "Very little initially. The transfers occurred without my knowledge over 18 months. When I discovered them, I engaged legal counsel and forensic accounting to assess what had happened." "Yes, we've reviewed those findings. They've been helpful to our investigation." She paused, studying my reaction. "Ms. Harrington, we believe you were a victim in this situation, not a participant. Your cooperation could be valuable in understanding the full scope of what occurred." The request seemed simple on its surface, but carried complex implications for my already strained family relationships. Cooperation with a federal investigation would transform what we had contained as a private family matter into potential criminal proceedings. I need to consult my attorney before discussing this further, I said carefully. Of course. Agent? Morales handed me her card. Please contact me after speaking with counsel. We'll need to schedule a formal interview within the next few days. After she departed, I sat motionless in the conference room, absorbing the seismic implications. The quarterly performance review I had been preparing for moments earlier now seemed trivially distant compared to the landscape-altering information I had just received. I called Richard immediately, relaying the conversation and arranging to meet at his office that afternoon. Then I contacted Dr. Winters to reschedule my presentation, citing a personal emergency requiring immediate attention, without further elaboration. By 2 o'clock, I sat in Richard's office while he consulted with colleague Patricia Sandoval, who specialized in white-collar criminal investigations. Her assessment was direct and sobering. Based on what you've described, the DOJ is likely pursuing wire fraud and securities fraud charges focused on TechNexus's leadership and potentially those who facilitated investments based on misrepresentations, Patricia explained. Your position appears to be that of a defrauded investor rather than a participant in the scheme. What are my obligations here? I asked, still processing the implications. Legally, you should cooperate with the investigation to protect your own interests, Patricia advised. The mediation agreement doesn't shield anyone from criminal liability, and attempting to obstruct a federal investigation would create serious additional risks. And my family? Nathan specifically? Patricia's expression conveyed professional caution. I can't advise Nathan or your parents. They would need their own counsel. But I can tell you that if TechNexus's technology claims were knowingly falsified to obtain investments, including your trust funds, the principals involved face significant legal exposure. Richard, who had remained thoughtfully silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Eliza, this development changes the context of everything we've been addressing through the mediation agreement. If TechNexus was fundamentally misrepresenting its technology, the company's value, and by extension your equity position, may be minimal, regardless of operational improvements. The implications cascaded through my understanding of the past months. The independent director's more rigorous prioritization of development focus, the strategic partnership exploration with Corinth, even Nathan's newfound appreciation for practical constraints, all potentially responses to the fundamental technology limitations now being investigated. I scheduled the interview with Agent Morales for the following morning, then faced the immediate question of whether to inform my family about the investigation. Patricia advised against it, noting that doing so could potentially be construed as tipping off subjects of an active investigation. Richard concurred from a strategic perspective, though he acknowledged the personal complexity this created. The hours that followed brought cascading challenges. I received a text from Nathan asking about the Corinth partnership proposal I had promised to review, a mundane business inquiry now overshadowed by potential criminal implications. My mother called to confirm plans for her birthday dinner the following weekend, her cheerful tone painfully discordant with the gravity of what I now knew. I navigated these interactions with careful neutrality, neither revealing the investigation nor making commitments I might be unable to fulfill depending on how events unfolded. This compartmentalization required constant vigilance, a parallel consciousness tracking both the surface conversation and its hidden context. The formal interview with Agent Morales the next morning lasted 3 hours. With Patricia present as counsel, I provided comprehensive information about the trust fund diversions, what I had been told about TechNexus's technology and market position, and the specifics of the mediation agreement. I shared documentation from the forensic accounting investigation and described the governance changes implemented at TechNexus following our settlement. Ms. Harrington, Agent Morales said as the interview concluded, based on the information you've provided and our ongoing investigation, we may need to execute search warrants at TechNexus offices and potentially your parents' home within the next 48-72 hours. I understand this creates a difficult personal situation for you, but I must emphasize that discussing the investigation with anyone potentially involved could constitute obstruction of justice. The warning was delivered professionally, but left no ambiguity about the seriousness of maintaining confidentiality, even from family members. I left the Justice Department offices feeling simultaneously relieved to have completed the interview, and burdened by knowledge I couldn't share with those most affected by it. That evening, as I attempted to focus on routine tasks at home, my phone rang with Nathan's number. I almost declined the call, uncertain of my ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while withholding critical information. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Eliza? Something strange is happening," Nathan began without preamble. James Corinth suddenly withdrew from partnership discussions citing compliance concerns, and our lead developer just received a call from someone asking detailed questions about our validation methodology. His voice carried genuine confusion rather than his typical confidence, suggesting he might not be fully aware of the investigation's scope. I chose my words with extreme care. "That does sound concerning. Have you discussed this with the independent directors?" "I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning," he replied. "As an equity holder with observer rights, you should attend. This could significantly impact the company's trajectory." The invitation placed me in an impossible position. Attending the meeting with knowledge of the federal investigation while maintaining silence would be ethically questionable at best. Yet, declining without explanation would raise immediate suspicions. "I'm not sure I can make it," I said, searching for neutral ground. "I have some pressing matters at Meridian tomorrow." "This is more important than hospital scheduling, Eliza," Nathan insisted, irritation edging into his tone. "The company you own a third of might be facing a crisis. I need allies who understand the larger vision beyond immediate challenges." The familiar pattern of dismissing my professional commitments while expecting immediate accommodation for his priorities would normally have triggered either acquiescence or direct confrontation. Instead, I found a third path. "I understand this is important, Nathan. Let me see what I can rearrange, but I can't make promises until I review my obligations tomorrow morning." After we disconnected, I called Patricia for guidance. Her advice was unequivocal. Do not attend that board meeting. Your presence with knowledge of the investigation would place you in an untenable position. If necessary, develop a last-minute conflict that prevents your attendance. The following morning brought the catalyst event I had sensed approaching, but couldn't have fully anticipated. At 7:15 a.m., my mother called, her voice strained with panic. "Eliza, federal agents are at our house with a search warrant. They're taking computers, financial records, everything related to TechNexus. What is happening?" The moment crystallized, the impossible tension between family loyalty and legal obligations. "Mom, I don't know the details, but you need to contact an attorney immediately. Don't answer questions without counsel present." "This must be some misunderstanding," she insisted. "Your father is trying to explain our investment arrangements, but they're not listening. Can you come over? Maybe you can help clarify things." "I can't get involved in this, Mom," I said, the words painful but necessary. "This is a federal investigation. You and Dad need proper legal representation, not family intervention." Her voice sharpened with sudden suspicion. "Did you know about this? Is this happening because of your complaints about the trust fund?" The question cut deeply, reflecting her continued inability to distinguish between appropriate accountability and vindictive punishment. "This isn't about the mediation agreement. It appears to involve questions about TechNexus's technology and investment representations. Please call an attorney." As I ended the call, my phone immediately lit up with Nathan's name. I let it go to voicemail, unable to navigate that conversation within the constraints of what I could legally disclose. Minutes later, a text appeared. "Federal agents at TechNexus office and my apartment. What have you done?" The accusation reflected the established family pattern. Difficulties in Nathan's life must be someone else's fault, most often mine for failing to provide unlimited support. Before I could decide how or whether to respond, another call came through from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Eliza Harrington?" a male voice confirmed. "This is David Klein, counsel for TechNexus. I understand. Federal agents are executing search warrants related to the company. Given your equity position and previous legal actions regarding trust investments, we need to coordinate our response to this situation." "Mr. Klein, I've retained separate counsel and cannot discuss the investigation," I replied firmly. "So you did know about this?" he concluded. "Your brother believes your cooperation with authorities triggered these raids. If that's the case, we'll need to reassess your position within the company governance structure." The implicit threat reflected how thoroughly Nathan and his representatives misunderstood the current reality. My equity position, secured through the mediation agreement after the trust fund misappropriation, was now the least of their concerns given potential criminal charges. "I suggest you focus on addressing the investigation's substance rather than searching for someone to blame," I advised before ending the call. Within hours, the situation escalated further. News of the federal raids appeared in local business publications, with technology blogs quickly picking up the story. By afternoon, my normally quiet social media accounts were flooded with messages from extended family members, former classmates, and professional contacts, all seeking insight into what one headline described as "Federal Fraud Investigation Rocks Promising Healthcare Startup." This public dimension transformed what had been a private family matter into a community spectacle. Colleagues at Meridian cast curious glances as I moved through the hospital corridors. Dr. Winters called me to his office to offer support and assurance that the situation wouldn't affect my professional standing, a conversation that was simultaneously comforting and mortifying. By evening, the Catalyst event had completely shattered the careful balance I had been maintaining between parallel paths. The federal investigation had collapsed these separate trajectories into a single, unavoidable reality that demanded immediate navigation without the luxury of gradual adjustment. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by increasingly frantic messages from family members and the steady accumulation of news coverage, I recognized that we had reached a point of no return. Whatever careful reconstructions we had been attempting through the mediation agreement had been rendered obsolete by forces beyond our control. Yet within this chaotic disruption, I found unexpected clarity. The investigation had stripped away pretenses and rationalizations, revealing fundamental truths about both TechNexus and the family dynamics that had enabled its deceptions. While painful, this forced confrontation with reality created potential for more authentic resolution than our negotiated settlement had achieved. The Catalyst event had accelerated my journey beyond what I could have voluntarily chosen, pushing me from measured recalibration into territory that demanded immediate, decisive action. The path forward would require navigating not just family, expectations, and personal boundaries, but potentially serious legal consequences affecting those closest to me. As I prepared for the difficult days ahead, I realized that this unexpected acceleration had revealed my growing capacity to maintain clarity and principle amid chaos, a strength I had always possessed but rarely recognized or claimed. The challenge before me would test this capacity to its limits, but for the first time, I approached such a test with confidence in my ability to navigate it without sacrificing either integrity or compassion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.